Welcome to the Political Economy of the Environment. Today's episode is about carbon pricing and specifically about what price we should have on carbon and about what sometimes is called the social cost of carbon. In our previous episode, we talked about why to put a price on carbon. And just to recap briefly, one reason is that pricing is a policy instrument that's quite cost effective in the short run, encouraging people to reduce emissions in the lowest cost fashion. A second reason is that carbon pricing can provide incentives for technological change, cost-saving changes that reduce the cost of alternative energy and energy efficiency investments. A third reason is that carbon pricing can set an envelope on the total quantity of emissions we're going to allow. Unlike other policy instruments, carbon pricing, if done right with hard emissions targets, can ensure that we hit our emissions reductions objectives without the uncertainty that comes with reliance on other instruments alone. Finally, carbon pricing provides what we call protective rent. It's in effect charging for the use of a parking lot, the global parking lot for carbon emissions. And by charging for the use of that parking lot, we're protecting it from overuse and abuse. We're protecting the Earth's climate from destabilization. So if we're going to do this, what price will we need on carbon emissions? And a convenient thing to remember is that when we're talking about dollars per ton of carbon dioxide, what that translates into is cents per gallon of gasoline or petrol. A $1 per ton carbon dioxide charge translates into an additional cent on a gallon of gasoline. So $100 per ton of carbon dioxide would translate into $1 on a gallon of gasoline. First, let's look at what some of the actually existing prices are for carbon in the markets that have been established under various climate policies. There's several examples of these. The Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative in the northeastern United States, the European Union's emissions trading system, and California's cap and trade system are three of the best known examples. The price at RGGI, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, at around the time that I'm filming this video in late 2017, was about $4 per ton of CO2. This is for emissions of carbon from power plants in the northeastern states. $4 per ton of CO2, as you'll appreciate, is a pretty modest price. It would be equivalent to 4 cents on a gallon of gasoline. What about in the European emissions trading system, which is a bigger system? The price on carbon emissions there around this time is a little under 8 euros per ton of CO2. 8 euros per ton is about $9 US dollars per ton of CO2. Again, a rather modest price. In California, which has a cap and trade system set up under its Global Warming Solutions Act of 2006, carbon permits are currently trading at about $15 per ton of CO2. So a bit higher than under RGGI or under the EU ETS, but still $15 per ton of CO2 is pretty modest. It would translate into 15 cents on a gallon of gasoline. Now, instead of looking at what the actual prices are in the policies that have been implemented so far, let's think a little bit about what should be the price on carbon. One way to think about that is to think about the cost of burning carbon. How much does that impact us and future generations? What's the social cost of burning carbon? That is a good indicator of what kind of price we ought to use. But figuring out what that social cost is a non-trivial task and one that's fraught with various, not only practical difficulties, but ethical difficulties. Should the price be based on safety? Should the objective be to try to ensure that we are protecting the stability of the Earth's climate for future generations and we want to maintain a safe world for people to live on? Or should it be based on the efficiency criterion of neoclassical economics, where we're weighing up costs and benefits, we're discounting the benefits to future generations by a discount rate to bring them to their present value, and we're deciding, well, how much should we be spending today to protect the Earth's climate for future generations? The safety criterion is the one that's used in most environmental policy, including the U.S. Clean Air Act, which mandates that the EPA should set air quality standards for the protection of public health and welfare, and to do so allowing an adequate margin of safety. U.S. climate policy takes place under the rubric of that Clean Air Act since the Supreme Court's historic 2007 decision in the case of Massachusetts et al. Versus EPA, in which it ruled that the EPA has the mandate to regulate carbon dioxide emissions under the terms of the Clean Air Act. That is to say, on the basis of safety. Similarly, safety is the basis for the standard agreed upon in Paris by international negotiators in 2015, who decided the goal should be to hold the increase in global average temperature to well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. An alternative way to set the target would be on the basis of efficiency. And there are two different meanings of efficiency that are important to bear in mind. There's the one that most people have in mind when they think of efficiency, which is, well, what's the most cost-effective way to do what we want to do, to get from A to B? But the meaning that neoclassical economists have in mind when they're talking about efficiency, it's about deciding where we want to go in the first place, what B should be, what the ends should be, not just the means of getting to the ends. And that's where cost-benefit analysis gets used, and where all the issues surrounding discounting and putting dollar values on damages to the environment, etc., come into play. And the difference between these two approaches comes out in the difference between these two carbon price paths that are set forth in a recent article by economist William Nordhaus from Yale that appeared in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences early in 2017. The blue line shows a price path based on the neoclassical criterion of efficiency, weighing up costs and benefits, discounting impacts in the future to get their present values and comparing those to the costs of reducing emissions, and comes up with a price path for emissions that rises from about $36 per ton of CO2 in 2020, that's 36 cents on a gallon of gasoline, up to about $100 in 2050. That rise is not inflation, these are in constant dollars, so that would be adding $1 to the price of gasoline in current purchasing power terms in 2050. The upper line is the one that would be based on a safety standard that's more relaxed than that of the Paris Agreement, that would hold total emissions to a level that would result in a global mean temperature increase above pre-industrial levels of 2.5 degrees Celsius. And that emissions trajectory, instead of going from $36 to $100 a ton, goes from about $230 a ton in 2020 up to $1,000 per ton in 2050. In other words, it would add about $2 to the price of a gallon of gasoline in the near future, and add about $10 to the price of a gallon of gasoline by the middle of the century. What kind of emissions trajectories and temperature trajectories go with those two different scenarios, those two different price scenarios? Well, in this graph, we can compare them. The blue line up here is the neoclassical efficient or optimum recommended by the integrated assessment model used by Nordhaus, in which the price trajectory is the relatively modest one I showed in the previous slide, going up to about $100 per ton at mid-century. And that trajectory would have our total emissions end up with a global mean temperature increase above pre-industrial levels of 3.5 degrees Celsius. That's more than 6 degrees Fahrenheit by the end of this century. Those would be temperatures that the world has not experienced since 125,000 years ago. The 2.5 degrees maximum increase scenario is shown by the green line here, and that would result in those much higher prices that we talked about in the last slide. The lower red line, which practically maps the green line, is from a different cost-benefit analysis that uses a higher discount rate. That was done by the economist Nicholas Stern and his team for the UK government. in what's called the Stern Review. And the top line shows what's called a business as usual scenario or baseline scenario. Some people call it the road to hell. That's if we don't do anything, if emissions just continue to go up with no further policies to reduce their increase, no carbon price, for example, and that shows mean temperature increases going up to 4 degrees Celsius by the turn of the next century. And of course, in both that road to hell scenario and in the neoclassical efficiency scenario, emissions are continuing to rise pretty substantially as we get into the years past 2100, whereas under the maximum temperature safety scenario and under that of the Stern Review, emissions are leveling out. So the bottom line is that carbon pricing is a really important instrument in climate policy, but that in order to meet the safety goals of Paris, the goal of holding global mean temperature increases to well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, we're going to need carbon prices that are considerably above the current levels we see in actually existing carbon markets, and are considerably above the so-called social cost of carbon that's recommended by many neoclassical economists. We're going to need some pretty substantial carbon prices. Let's not throw out the carbon pricing baby with the social cost of carbon bathwater. We need a carbon price, but we need to base it on the safety of future generations and the protection of our planet, not on the efficiency criterion coming out of cost-benefit analysis. Thanks very much.